Empty your pockets right now, kid, or I will do it for you, and you will not like how I do it. The boy stood on the sidewalk outside a small grocery store on Martin Luther King Boulevard in the city of Richmond, Virginia. His name was Darius Cole, and he was 16 years old, and he had just bought a bag of chips and a bottle of juice. He held the receipt in his left hand and the plastic bag in his right hand, and he did not move. Two police officers stood in front of him, and one of them had his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. The officer who had spoken was a tall man with a red face and a thick neck, and a name tag that read Sergeant Briggs. The second officer was younger and thinner, and his name tag said Officer Dalton, and he stood a few steps behind Briggs. A squad car sat parked at the curb with its lights still spinning blue and red, and the engine was still running loud. Darius looked at Sergeant Briggs, and then he looked at Officer Dalton, and then he looked back at Briggs again slowly. He did not put his hands in his pockets, and he did not drop his bag, and he just stood very still like a statue. Three people on the other side of the street stopped walking and turned to watch what was happening near the store entrance. A woman with a baby stroller pulled out her phone and began to record everything from about 30 feet away on the sidewalk. I said, empty your pockets, boy. Are you deaf or are you just stupid? Because I really cannot tell right now. Darius held up the receipt between two fingers, so both officers could see it clearly without him moving any closer to them. He spoke in a calm and steady voice that did not shake at all, even though his hands were starting to tremble just slightly. Sir, I just bought chips and juice from this store, and I have the receipt right here in my hand for you. Sergeant Briggs slapped the receipt out of his hand, and the small piece of paper floated down to the dirty sidewalk near the curb. Briggs stepped forward, so his face was only about 12 inches away from the face of the 16-year-old boy standing there. I did not ask you what you bought. I asked you to empty your pockets, so do what I told you to do. Officer Dalton shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and he looked around at the people who were watching from across the road. He leaned forward just a little bit and spoke in a low voice that was clearly meant only for Sergeant Briggs to hear clearly. Sarge, maybe we should just check the receipt and let this kid go on home, because people are starting to watch us now. Briggs did not turn around, and he did not lower his voice at all when he answered his partner standing right behind his back. Shut your mouth, Dalton. I have been doing this job for 19 years, and I do not need advice from a rookie officer. Darius bent down slowly and picked up the receipt from the ground, and he held it up again with his arm fully extended outward. Briggs knocked it out of his hand a second time, and this time it landed in a small puddle of brown water near the drain. You think you are smart, do you not? You think a little piece of paper is going to save you from me today. The store owner, a Korean man in his 60s named Mr. Park, came outside through the glass door and stood near the entrance watching everything. He was holding a broom in his right hand, and he looked at Darius, and then he looked at the two officers standing there. Officers, this boy is my customer, and he comes in here every single day after school, and he always pays for everything he buys. Briggs turned his head just enough to look at Mr. Park, and he pointed one thick finger at the store owner, and his face got redder. Get back inside your store right now, sir. This does not concern you, and I will not ask you a second time today. Mr. Park did not go inside, but he did take one step back, and he held the broom handle tighter in both his hands now. Two more people had stopped on the sidewalk across the street, and now there were 5 witnesses watching this whole scene happen in real time. Briggs grabbed Darius by the shoulder and spun him around hard, so the boy was now facing the brick wall of the grocery store building. The bag with the chips and the juice fell to the ground, and the juice bottle rolled off the curb and into the gutter water. Hands on the wall and spread your legs apart right now, because I'm about to search you for real this time, kid. Darius put his hands flat on the rough brick wall, and he spread his feet apart, and he did not say a single word this entire time. Briggs patted down his jacket pockets and his jeans pockets, and he pulled out a cell phone and a set of house keys and $4. He put all of those items on the hood of the squad car, and then he patted down the boy's legs all the way from the top to the bottom. "Where is it? Where are you hiding it? I know you have something on you because I can always tell with you people." Officer Dalton closed his eyes for just a second, and then he opened them again, and he let out a long, slow breath of air. He looked at the woman with the stroller who was still recording on her phone, and he looked down at his own shoes quickly. Briggs found nothing else on the boy, because there was nothing else to find on him at all, of course. He stepped back and crossed his arms over his chest, and he stared at the back of the boy's head with his jaw tight and hard. "Turn around and look at me when I am talking to you, boy, because I am not done with you yet, not even close." Darius turned around slowly, and he looked Briggs right in the eyes, and he still did not say a single word to the officer. His phone and his keys and his $4 were still sitting on the hot metal hood of the police squad car nearby. "You know what your problem is, kid. Your problem is that nobody ever taught you how to show respect to authority around here." Briggs picked up the $4 from the hood of the car, and he held the bills up and he looked at them and then back at the boy. "Where did you get this money from? Did you steal it? Because I find it very hard to believe you earned this yourself honestly." The woman with the stroller called out from across the street, in a loud and clear voice that everyone on the block could hear very well. "That boy did not do anything wrong. I have been watching this whole time, and you need to leave that child alone right now, officer." Briggs pointed across the street at her, without even looking in her direction, and he shouted back at her very loudly and sharply, "Mind your own business, lady, or I will come over there next, and we can have a conversation about obstruction of justice too." A man in a gray work uniform who had been watching from the bus stop pulled out his phone too and started recording from a different spot. Now there were two cameras pointed at this scene, and Briggs either did not notice or he simply did not care about it at all. Briggs tossed the $4 on the ground at the feet of Darius, and the bills scattered on the wet sidewalk near his sneakers right away. "Pick up your little money and get out of my sight before I find a real reason to put you in the back of my car today." Darius bent down and picked up each dollar bill one at a time, and he put them back in his pocket without saying anything at all. He reached for his phone and his keys on the hood of the squad car, but Briggs put his hand down on top of them first quickly. "I did not say you could take those yet. Did I say you could take those? I do not remember saying that to you at all." Officer Dalton took a small step forward, and he cleared his throat, and he spoke again in that same low and careful voice he used before. "Sarge, come on, the kid is clean, let him go. We have actual calls waiting for us right now on the radio in the car." Briggs kept his hand on the phone and the keys for 5 more seconds, and then he slowly lifted it and stepped back from the hood. Darius picked up his phone and his keys, and he put them in his pocket, and he picked up the plastic bag from the dirty ground below. The juice bottle was still in the gutter, so he walked over and bent down to get it, and Briggs laughed out loud at him right then. "Look at him picking through the gutter like a little rat. That is exactly where your kind belongs if you ask me about it honestly." Officer Dalton looked away and he put his hand over his mouth, and he did not say a word this time to Briggs or to anyone else. The woman with the stroller shook her head and she kept recording, and the man at the bus stop did the same exact thing on his phone. Darius stood up with the juice bottle in his hand, and there was mud on his white sneakers and dirty water on his fingers and his knees. He looked at Briggs one more time, and this time he spoke, and his voice was still calm and still steady and still very clear. "My mother told me to always stay calm and to always be polite, and to always remember that the truth always wins in the end." Briggs laughed again, and he put his hands on his hips, and he leaned forward toward the boy with a big, ugly smile on his red face. "Oh, your mother told you that. Well, your mother sounds like a real piece of work. I bet she is real proud of her little gutter rat boy." And right at that exact moment, a black SUV, with dark tinted windows, pulled up to the curb right behind the parked squad car on the street. The SUV had no sirens and no police markings on it, but it did have a small round government seal on the front door panel. The engine shut off and the driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out, and she was tall and she wore a dark blue suit jacket. She had a gold badge clipped to her belt, and she had a lanyard around her neck with a photo identification card hanging from it clearly. She walked toward the scene with long, steady steps, and her heels clicked on the sidewalk, and she looked directly at Sergeant Briggs the whole time. She stopped about 5 feet away from him, and she looked at Darius, and then she looked at the items in his hands and the mud on his shoes. Then she looked at Briggs, and she did not blink, and she did not smile, and she spoke in a voice that was quiet but somehow filled the whole entire block. "Sergeant, I need you to tell me exactly why you have my son pressed up against a wall, with his belongings thrown on the ground like trash." Briggs opened his mouth, and then he closed it, and then he opened it again, and he looked at the gold badge on her belt very carefully now. The woman reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a leather case, and she flipped it open and held it up so Briggs could read every single word on it. The badge inside was gold, and it had the seal of the United States Department of Justice on it, and below the seal it read Special Agent in Charge. Her name was printed on the identification card beneath a photo of her face, and it said Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Cole, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Briggs took a full step backward, and his boots scraped on the concrete, and his face went from red to white in about 2 seconds flat right there. Officer Dalton stood completely still like someone had pressed a pause button on him, and his mouth hung open just a tiny little bit wide. "I asked you a question, Sergeant, and I expect an answer right now. Why were you searching my son on this public sidewalk today?" Briggs tried to stand up straight, and he tried to make his voice sound normal, but it came out dry and cracked like old paint peeling off wood. "Ma'am, we received a report of a shoplifting suspect, matching the description of a young male in this area near the store today." Victoria Cole tilted her head to the side just slightly, and she looked at Briggs the way a teacher looks at a student who just told a very bad lie. "A young male, that is the description you received. A young male, and that was enough for you to stop and search my 16-year-old son today." She turned to Mr. Park, who was still standing near the door of his store holding his broom, and she spoke to him directly and clearly now. "Sir, did you call the police and report a shoplifting suspect at your store today, or at any time this afternoon or this morning at all?" Mr. Park shook his head quickly and firmly, and he stepped forward 1 step, and he pointed at Darius with his free hand right away. "No, ma'am, I did not call anyone. This boy is a good kid, and he pays every time, and I have security cameras that can prove all of it." Victoria turned back to Briggs, and she let that answer hang in the air between them for a long 3 seconds of complete total silence on the block. "So there was no call, and there was no report, and there was no description, and you stopped my son for absolutely no legal reason at all." Briggs opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, and he closed it again, and he looked over at Dalton for some kind of help or support. Dalton did not move, and he did not speak, and he kept his eyes locked on the ground near his feet like something very interesting was down there. Victoria Cole reached into her other pocket, and she pulled out her personal cell phone, and she held it up so Briggs could see the screen clearly. On the screen was a live video feed from a doorbell camera that showed the front of the grocery store from a building directly across the street. She had been watching the entire encounter from the moment the squad car had pulled up to the curb with its lights flashing blue and red. "I watched you slap a receipt out of my son's hand twice. I watched you throw his money on the ground in a dirty, wet puddle below. I watched you call him a rat, and I watched you insult his mother, which is me, and I recorded every single second of all of it." Briggs swallowed hard, and his throat moved up and down, and a small line of sweat ran down the side of his face from his forehead right then. He tried to speak again, and this time some words actually came out of his mouth, but they were shaky and weak and thin sounding. "Ma'am, I was just following standard procedure for a stop and search, and I did not mean any disrespect to you or your son today." Victoria put her phone back in her pocket, and she took one more step toward Briggs, so she was now only about 3 feet away from his face. She was almost as tall as he was in her heels, and she looked at him with eyes that were steady and sharp and completely unafraid of him. Standard procedure, is that what you call it? Because I have been a federal agent for 22 years, and I have never seen any procedure that looks like what you just did to a child. She turned to the woman with the stroller, who was still recording everything on her phone from across the street, with her arm held up high. Ma'am, thank you for recording. Please do not delete that video. I may need it as evidence in a formal investigation very soon from now. The woman nodded, and she called back across the street in that same loud and clear voice she had used before to defend the boy earlier. I got every single second of it on video. Ma'am, every single word he said to that boy is right here on my phone saved already. The man at the bus stop held up his phone too, and he waved it in the air so Victoria could see it from where she was standing on the sidewalk. I got it too, ma'am. From this angle right here. You can see everything clear as day on my phone from start to finish of it all. Victoria nodded at both of them, and then she turned back to Briggs, and she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small black notebook from inside. She opened it and she clicked a pen, and she looked at his name tag, and she wrote down his name and his badge number very carefully on the paper. Sergeant Briggs, badge number 4721, assigned to the Richmond Police Department, 3rd District, afternoon shift patrol unit today. Briggs watched her write, and his hands were shaking now, and he clasped them together in front of his belt to try to make them stop moving. Ma'am, I think there has been a misunderstanding here, and I am sure we can work this out without it becoming a bigger thing than it needs to be. Victoria closed the notebook and she put it back in her jacket, and she clicked the pen closed, and she looked at Briggs without any expression on her face. A misunderstanding is when someone takes the wrong coffee cup from a table at a restaurant by accident on a busy morning. Sergeant Briggs, what you did today was stop a child without cause and search him without consent and insult him, and humiliate him on a public street corner in front of witnesses. She turned to Officer Dalton and she looked at him, and her voice changed just a little bit, and it became something almost close to gentle toward him. Officer Dalton, I heard you try to stop this 3 separate times today, and I want you to know that I saw that and it has been noted officially. Dalton nodded once, and he looked up from the ground for the first time in several minutes, and his eyes were wet and red around the edges now. He spoke in a quiet voice, and his words came out slow and careful like he was choosing each one with great precision and thought. Ma'am, I am sorry. I should have done more to stop it. I should have stepped in harder, and I did not, and that is something I have to live with now. Victoria looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded once, and she turned to her son, who had been standing still and silent this whole time watching everything. Darius, baby, are you hurt anywhere on your body? Did he touch you in any way that caused you any pain at all anywhere right now? Darius shook his head slowly and he looked at his mother, and for the first time since this whole thing began his voice had a small crack inside of it. No, ma'am, I am not hurt. I did what you always told me to do, and I stayed calm, and I was polite the whole entire time through all of it. Victoria walked over to her son, and she put one hand on his cheek, and she looked at his face and his muddy shoes and his dirty wet knees carefully. She wiped a smudge of dirt off his forehead with her thumb, and she straightened the collar of his jacket with both of her hands gently and slowly. You did good, baby. You did exactly right, and I am so proud of you for keeping your head when a grown man tried to take your dignity away today. And she turned back to Briggs one final time, and she stood between him and her son like a wall made of steel and stone and fire and law. Sergeant Briggs, at 900 hours tomorrow morning, you will receive a formal notice of investigation from the Office of Professional Responsibility at the Department of Justice. Your body camera footage will be pulled tonight, and it will be reviewed frame by people who do this for a living every single day. The 2 civilian videos will be collected as supporting evidence, along with the security camera footage from this store owned by Mr. Park right here today. You are not suspended yet, but I strongly suggest you call your union representative tonight, because you are going to need one very soon from right now. Briggs stood there, and he did not move, and he did not speak, and his face was the color of old newspaper left out in the rain too long. His hands were still clasped together in front of his belt, and his knuckles were white, and his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might actually break apart. Victoria reached down and picked up the receipt from the puddle where it had been floating, since Briggs knocked it out of her son's hand the second time earlier. She unfolded it carefully, and she held it up so Briggs could see the faded ink and the store name, and the date and time printed clearly on it. One bag of barbecue chips, $1.79, one bottle of apple juice, $2.49, paid in cash at 3:47 this afternoon today. This is what you decided to throw your career away over today, Sergeant. A bag of chips and a bottle of juice bought by a 16-year-old boy. She folded the receipt and put it in her pocket, and she turned to Mr. Park, and she spoke to him with respect and warmth in her voice now. Mr. Park, thank you for coming outside and speaking up for my son today, and I would like to get a copy of your security camera footage as soon as possible, please. Mr. Park nodded quickly, and he leaned the broom against the wall, and he pulled a set of keys from his apron pocket and held them up to her right away. You can have it right now, ma'am. I will pull it up on the computer inside and put it on a flash drive for you in 5 minutes or maybe less. Victoria nodded, and then she put her hand on her son's shoulder, and she walked him toward the black SUV parked behind the squad car at the curb. She opened the passenger door for him, and Darius got inside, and she closed the door, and then she turned around and looked at Briggs one last time standing there. 19 years on the job. That is what you told your partner earlier today. 19 years. And you still have not learned the most basic rule of all, Sergeant. Briggs finally spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper, and it cracked on every other word that came out of his dry, cracked mouth. And what rule is that, ma'am? What rule are you talking about right now exactly, if you do not mind telling me, please? Victoria opened her car door, and she stood there with one foot inside the SUV and one foot still on the curb of the sidewalk outside. The rule is simple, Sergeant. Every child belongs to someone, and you never know who that someone might be until it is already far too late for you. She got in the SUV, and she started the engine, and she pulled away from the curb slowly, and the black vehicle turned the corner and was gone from view. Briggs stood on the sidewalk, and he did not move for a long time, and Dalton stood behind him, and they both just stared at the empty street in silence. The woman with the stroller finally put her phone down, and she shook her head one more time, and she pushed the stroller down the sidewalk and walked away quietly. The man at the bus stop put his phone in his pocket, and his bus pulled up and he got on it, and the bus drove away down the long block. Park went back inside his store, and the glass door swung shut behind him, and the little bell above it rang once softly in the warm afternoon air. Briggs finally turned and walked back to the squad car, and he opened the driver's side door, and he sat down behind the wheel, and he stared straight ahead at nothing. Dalton got in the passenger side, and he closed his door, and he buckled his seat belt, and he looked out his window at the store and the sidewalk and the gutter. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them turned off the spinning lights, and the squad car just sat there at the curb for a very long time in the quiet. 7 weeks later, a short article appeared on page 4 of the Richmond Times newspaper, with a small headline in plain black letters across the top of it. The headline said that Sergeant Raymond Briggs of the 3rd District had been terminated from the Richmond Police Department after a federal review of conduct. The article said that body camera footage and 2 civilian videos and 1 store security recording had all confirmed the findings of the investigation fully and completely. Officer Thomas Dalton had been reassigned to the department's new Community Outreach Division, and he had agreed to lead bias training workshops for new recruits starting in September. The last line of the article mentioned that the federal investigation had been overseen by Special Agent in charge Dr. Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Cole of the FBI Richmond Field Office. It did not mention that she was the mother of the boy, because that detail had been kept out of the official report on purpose, and by her own request specifically. Darius Cole went back to that same grocery store the very next day after school, and he bought the same bag of barbecue chips and the same bottle of apple juice from Mr. Park. He paid in cash and he took his receipt and he folded it neatly and he put it in his back pocket and he walked home in clean white sneakers on the same sidewalk. Mr. Park watched him go through the glass door and he smiled and he picked up his broom and he went back to sweeping the floor of his small store quietly.